In the early 1950s, Jacques Lacan gave his interpretation of one of Freud's most famous cases, the patient who came to be known by the pseudonym the Rat Man. The Neurotics Individual Myth, Lacan's paper on this case, is his masterwork on obsession, and here we're going to look at what he had to say about the Rat Man and obsession in general. This video is based on 4 texts: Freud's published case history from the Standard Edition, the French version with Freud's original case notes, Lacan's paper on the case, and biographical material from Mikhail Bork-Jacobson's Les Passions de Freud. So, who was the Rat Man? His real name was Ernst Lanzer, a 29-year-old lawyer who had already taken 10 years to complete his law studies at the University of Vienna by the time he came to consult Freud. Born on the 22nd of January 1878 in Vienna, he was from a middle-class home, the son of Rosa Herlinger from the Zaborski family, one of the most powerful industrial families in the city, and Heinrich Lanzer from a modest Silesian family and 9 years his wife's senior. Ernst was the 4th of 7 children. In 1898, a woman working for Zaborski makes an advance on Ernst, which he avoids, but tragedy results. The woman kills herself. This only confirms his idea that his thoughts have the power to kill. At the same time, he falls in love with a poor girl, Gisela Adler, and the idea comes to him that if his father were to die, he would have enough money to marry her. His father dies the following year. Ernst inherits 59,000 kroner, but does not marry Gisela. The Rat Man got his pseudonym from obsessive thoughts about a torture method involving rats that was first described by the 16th century Dutch soldier Diederik Sonoy. While out on manoeuvres in the army, the Rat Man hears this story about especially horrible punishment used in the East. And it's this graphic story and the role it's said to have played in the development of his neurosis that's commonly believed to be the reason Freud lent his patient the pseudonym the Rat Man. However, this signifier rat in German holds a much wider spell on Freud's patient. That Freud notes its reappearance in the crucial details of the Rat Man's story suggests that it was perhaps the reappearance of this signifier that he was drawing our attention to in the naming of the case. Nevertheless, almost every analyst and every historian has focused on the rat torture in their reading of the case. But not Lacan. Lacan focuses on another, less dramatic but more illustrative story that the patient tells Freud. It came to the patient from the same character who told him about the rat torture, the Czech captain from his military manoeuvres, known as the cruel captain in the case. A few remarks about Lacan's approach to the Rat Man case and to obsession more generally. Lacan needed to take a different approach to obsession because Freud admitted in 1926 that obsession is still something of a mystery to him. Obsessional neurosis presents such a vast multiplicity of phenomena, says Freud, that no efforts have yet succeeded in making a coherent synthesis of all its variations. All we can do is to pick out certain typical correlations, but there's always the risk that we may have overlooked other uniformities of a no less important kind. Freud has lots of questions about obsession. He says, for example, that he doesn't know why ambivalence is such a feature of it. And in that same passage he says, obsessional neurosis is unquestionably the most interesting and repaying subject of analytic research. From Lacan's point of view, he looks at what constitutes the structure of obsession. The obsessional asks a question about himself. This question addresses the problem of how to sustain contradictory desires. In the Écrit, Lacan summarizes his approach to the problem as follows. One does not simply need the blueprints to a reconstructed labyrinth, nor even a pile of blueprints that have already been worked up. What is needed above all is the general combinatory that no doubt governs their variety, but that also, even more usefully, accounts for the illusions, or better, shifts in the labyrinth that take place right before one's very eyes. But there is no shortage of either in obsessive neurosis, which is an architecture of contrasts that have not yet been sufficiently noticed and that cannot simply be attributed to differing facades. Lacan's focus in the case is instead on an unpaid debt. The Rat Man loses a pair of glasses whilst he's out on manoeuvres in the military, and he wires for a new pair which are delivered to a military post office nearby. But as he himself is not there to pick them up and pay the charges on them, another man, Lieutenant A, who runs the post office, covers this for him. The captain tells him he has to pay back Lieutenant A, but what the captain doesn't know is that duties at the post office have been handed over to Lieutenant B a few days prior. The Rat Man, however, is aware of this. The Rat Man then starts to construct a whole series of weird and circuitous ways in which the debt can be settled. Firstly, he asks another officer who is going to the post office to give the money to Lieutenant A, but this man claims never to have seen him there. Then he finds Lieutenant A himself, but the latter admits it was actually Lieutenant B who paid for it. So Lieutenant A says he cannot accept the money. He then hatches a plan in which the three men, he himself and Lieutenants A and B, will all go to the post office together, where A will pay the young lady in the post office, who will then give the money to B, and that then, bizarrely, he will pay the money to A to fulfill the original, though mistaken, command of the Czech captain. However, it was neither Lieutenant A nor Lieutenant B who paid the charges for him, but the girl in the post office. And what's more, the Rat Man knew this all along, before even the Czech captain told him mistakenly that it was Lieutenant A that he owed. At the simplest level, what this weird and circuitous story about the repayment of a debt tells us is that although doubt has always been privileged in accounts of obsession, this is not about doubt. The Rat Man knew very well that the money is actually owed to the lady in the post office, and that she'd be out of pocket if the obsessive scenario were fulfilled. Indeed, Lacan notes that when the Rat Man gets into analysis with Freud, he very simply transfers the necessary funds to the lady at the post office. Why is this obsession, which exhibits that logicality peculiar to neurotics, interesting? Lacan highlights two key events in the Rat Man's family history, elements of the subjective constellation, showing that this obsession is a ciphered repetition of those events, an unconscious intergenerational transmission. Firstly, that the Rat Man's father married far above his station, and through his richer wife gains his rank in the military and a higher social status. However, his wife always kids him about a poor but pretty girl who was the object of his affections shortly before their marriage. Secondly, a particularly shameful event in the father's military career, when he gambled away his regiment's funds and was only saved from humiliation by a friend who lent him the money to pay it back. Lacan sees obsession as a mythic construction. But what does this mean? Lacan says that we should look in the obsession for a scenario that has the same elements, reordered, as an event, or more precisely, a condensation of events, in the person's family history. This is exactly what he finds in the Rat Man's family history. The obsession with the repayment of the debt for the glasses is a ciphering or reshuffling of these initial elements. Borrowing an idea from his contemporary Claude Lévi-Strauss, Lacan proposes that this is akin to the structure of a myth. Lacan's idea of obsession shares a lot in common with, and probably borrows a lot from, Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea of myth. In particular, his idea of the myth theme as the essential kernel of a myth, a common, constant, minimal element, was almost certainly borrowed by Lacan for the purposes of his interpretation. A myth takes an insoluble problem, and rather than presenting a resolution to that problem, it reorders its elements into a parallel contradiction. Myths don't solve our problems or answer our questions, they simply just transpose them onto another terrain. Lacan describes the way in which we see this in the Rat Man's case. Everything happens, he says, as if the impasses inherent in the original situation move to another point in the mythic network, as if what was not resolved here always turned up over there. This is what Lacan notes about the Rat Man's obsession over the repayment of debt for his glasses. It restructures the two crucial elements in the events of his family history. Firstly, the repayment of the military debt. The obsession of repaying the other officers is a ciphered repetition of the incident where his father's friend bailed the latter out of his gambling debt. Secondly, the dichotomy rich woman, poor woman. Here we see the same substitution of the rich woman for the poor woman as with the father. Lacan says that the Rat Man's desire is not towards the lady in the post office, but another lady who incarnates that poor woman, a servant girl he met at an inn during the manoeuvres. This constitutes the individual myth of the neurotic. Lacan says, this phantasmatic scenario resembles a little play, a chronicle which is precisely the manifestation of what I call the neurotic's individual myth. What's interesting is that in both the events that Lacan finds of interest, there is a motif of something being left owed. Firstly, Lacan notes that the father never found the friend who bailed him out and so never managed to pay back the gambling debt. Secondly, the status that the Rat Man's father received thanks to having married a woman who was of a higher social standing to be able to give him access to the career in the military. The important thing is in no way to get to the truth of what actually happened in the Rat Man's history, but to find out how that history was assumed, given meaning by the subject himself, and how he situated himself in reference to it. Lacan makes this point very nicely. Myth is what provides a discursive form for something that cannot be transmitted through the definition of truth. But what turns the assumption of an unresolved element, in this case the unpaid debt of the father, into a neurotic constellation? For Lacan, the problem for the rat man lies in the fact that these debts are on two different levels. His neurosis is the result of an inability to rectify them. The elements of the debt are placed on two levels at once, he says, and it's precisely in the light of this impossibility of bringing these two levels together that the drama of the neurotic is played out. This is what the symptoms of the neurosis, the obsessions themselves, show. By trying to make one coincide with the other, he makes a perennially unsatisfying turning maneuver and never succeeds in closing the loop. The gap between the two debts is, Lacan says in the Écrit, unfillable. He says, it's by recognizing the forced subjectivization of the obsessive debt that Freud achieves his goal. This is the goal of bringing the subject to rediscover, in the story of his father's lack of delicacy, his marriage to the subject's mother, the pretty but penniless girl, his wounded love life, and this ungrateful forgetting of his beneficent friend, to rediscover in this story, along with the fateful constellation that presided over the subject's very birth, the unfillable gap constituted by the symbolic debt against which his neurosis is a protest. Thanks for watching. Read the full article on lacanonline.com for where Lacan takes this next.